Hi everyone. I just wanted to kind of add a little addendum to what we are covering this week because of the amount of content in Chapter 30 related to chromatic modulation. And since on Friday, we'll be taking a quiz and kind of reviewing all of this stuff, I thought that it would be good to go into a little bit more depth and explanation about how this idea of reinterpretation works. And I thought some clear examples, to show you some clear examples would be better. Specifically related to enharmonic modulation using the augmented sixth chord, which we've already talked about in depth, specifically the German augmented sixth chord, enharmonic reinterpretation of the diminished seventh chord, which can also be seen as enharmonic modulation using the diminished seventh chord, or using this process of getting to another key, and also getting to a distantly related key. And finally, this idea of voice leading chords, or linear chromaticism, which is related because it is a way to modulate, but there's no clear functional device that's being used. And I'll explain about that in a little bit using the Chopin example, the one that she uses in the book. So just to review, remember the enharmonic modulation using augmented sixth chords. With the German augmented sixth chord, we were able to take a 5/7 chord, a dominant seventh chord, which we would expect to resolve in a very conventional way as a dominant to tonic relationship, right? But here it sounds just like a German augmented sixth chord, so it resolves completely differently. And this is the way that composers would tonicize the leading tone. Never before had we really studied a way to do that. So now, for instance, a composer can modulate from C major to B minor or B major using this process of reinterpreting the 5/7 chord into a German augmented sixth chord. And you'll notice that the voice leading works exactly the same way that conventional augmented sixth chords work. That is, they're predominant chords, very strong predominant chords going to 5 or going to the cadential 6/4. So this is similar, but there's a lot more options here. And as we saw today in class, it's a lot more fluid because there are so many different ways that you can reinterpret a diminished seventh chord. Some ways to think about this is every note, all 4 notes within a diminished seventh chord could be reinterpreted to an enharmonic equivalent. So the example that we used today in class, very simple, was the leading tone seventh chord, the fully diminished version, right, which is kind of borrowed from minor. So here B, D, F, and A flat, and I voiced it in SATB. This resolves the way that you've always practiced, right, and that you would probably recognize by listening. A 7, fully diminished 7 goes to a 1 chord. Here's the leading tone resolving up to C, up to Do, and here is the 7th, A flat, resolving down. And then the smooth voice leading of here, the D goes down to the C, goes to tonic, and then the F goes to the flat. And I'll change that to a minor 1, or simply I could just change this to a natural. It's the same way, so now I can correct that to major 1. So here we see the conventional voice leading and function of a 7 fully diminished 7th chord going to now a major 1. Okay, but look what we can do here. We can take that same chord, reinterpret it. In fact, it's the exact same sounding inversion, but we've changed the root. If you were to stack this chord into thirds, it would put the G sharp on the bottom, right? That gives you the root. So G sharp, B, D, and F sounds exactly the same as this chord, but it has a completely different expectation of where it's going to, right? Now, this is heard as the tonicizing note, right? The tendency now for the root of a fully diminished 7th chord is to resolve up. So the G sharp goes to A, and that gives us a new tonic. So here, we could say that this is a fully diminished 7th chord, 6/5 inversion, and now it's going to 1, but in a completely different key. So this chord over here in C major could also be reinterpreted like this chord. So we could use this as a secondary leading tone 7th chord, or this could simply be used to modulate to a new key, in this case, A major. And the mediant relationship between C major and A major would sound quite dramatic, right? As we saw with all mediant relationships, the modal mixture mediant relationships and the chromatic mediant and the chromatic submediant relationships. So there you go. The exact same sound, now it's been reinterpreted. So this one, you can see, has been respelled, but we don't know what key it's going to. We can simply find that key by finding the root of this chord. So what would this be? If you see this chord here sounding the same, I've simply changed, I haven't changed the sound, but I've simply changed the actual notes. I've reinterpreted this chord enharmonically. So now the B, right, this B becomes a C flat, the F natural stays the same, the D natural stays the same, the G sharp is turned back to an A flat. What is this chord? Well, we know that it's a fully diminished 7th chord, right? What is the root? If we stack it in thirds, you'll notice that we would get D on the bottom. So it would be D, F, A flat, and C flat. Because D is the root of this chord, D is the leading tone, and D is the leading tone in what key? Right, E flat major or E flat minor. So in this case, I can now put that in, E flat major, and we can look at its resolution. And I put these in here for you. Now, because of the nature of a 4-2 chord to go to an inverted triad here, the 7 fully diminished 4-2 is resolving to a 5 chord. Okay, we don't see the reverse of this, but we do see fully diminished 7th chords resolving to the dominant chord. In this case, a 5-7, and then, of course, going on to a 1. So this chord was reinterpreted from either one of these, it doesn't matter. But now we could get from C major to E flat major, or from A major to E flat major. Or, of course, all of this would work in reverse as well. So what's also cool about this is you see that the mediant relationship is preserved as well. It's the nice thing about reinterpreting a fully diminished 7th chord. It's a symmetrical chord because it just always sounds like stacked minor thirds. So we change this to modulation to E flat major. And of course, you could make this minor as well. Same here. We could use this to modulate to A minor or to E flat minor. Okay, so that just kind of puts it into practice. So we can see that this process of enharmonic reinterpretation of the diminished 7th chord can be used either to tonicize new key areas, or in this case, you can imagine seeing it in a piece of music where a composer uses this to modulate to one of these new key areas. Okay. The last bit of material that I wanted to cover, but because there's a lot of content to cover this week, was this idea of linear chromaticism. And I'll write that up here. Linear chromaticism being a concept that is related to everything else in this chapter, specifically the idea of using passing and neighboring chords, which is kind of a way of combining, or the way that Elizabeth Marvin writes, is a way of combining embellishing tones vertically so that you can expand this idea of functional harmony. This is what we're doing here, right? We're expanding the idea that one chord can become many other different types of chords without even changing the sound, right? But by changing the voice leading. But sometimes this gets so fluid that the idea of function is completely lost, and it's not so important to think that all chords have a function. But clearly the melodic line and where the chord is going is important. But we wouldn't really know what key to analyze that chord in. We don't know if it's a secondary dominant chord. We wouldn't know if it's some other kind of borrowed chord. So we actually bring up this term called a voice leading chord, and that's what this VL stands for. And she goes into depth on this in page 637. You'll sometimes hear other theorists call these linear chords, apparent chords, embellishing chords. She chooses the term voice leading chords, and they all mean the same thing. This is an excerpt taken from the Chopin Prelude in C minor from his book of Preludes. And you'll see that if we look at this as a progression, right, we're going from 1 to the dominant chord, the contextual analysis here, tonic, and then we have some dominant prolongation here, 5 going to a 5-4-2, which will probably most likely go to a 1-6 chord, right? But there's many chords in here that are chromatic, and we have to be a little careful in how we analyze them. We could give it too much thought and say, well, maybe there's maybe other types of implication of another key here, and I don't think that's what Chopin is doing. What I notice about this excerpt is that the bass line here is moving down very specific and clear way, right? It's the descending chromatic bass line that we've seen in other pieces, this lament bass idea. So we have do, ti, te, la, le, sol, fa, right? We do skip that here, but by this point I think the idea is clear that Chopin is more interested in preserving the horizontal line rather than thinking about how these chords are implying other keys and things like that. So the way that we would analyze this is a 1 chord. This could be a 6 chord, and I should probably revise that here. But I think in most cases we could also analyze this as a 1 chord. It's just a recoloring of the 1 chord, right? Tonic prolongation. Mainly because look at how the bass jumps up to C. In that case, we could put it in first inversion. Either interpretation would probably be okay. And here we get our raised leading tone for the first time. Now there's 2 things that really stick out about this. The first is that what we say looks like a chromatic chord once this F sharp comes in, and it certainly is. This F sharp adds some complexity to how we would analyze this chord, but just looking at this sonority for this second, we say, a B natural, that's the leading tone. It wants to resolve up. It's probably some kind of dominant chord, but if we look at it further, we see the B, and then we have a D, and we have an A. Not an A flat. We don't have our dominant chord. We say, what is this chord? It's a very unusual sound. Then add F sharp to the mix. We can see that because we're in C minor here, this chord really doesn't look, it doesn't look all that familiar to us. So in this case, because we've already determined by looking at this that Chopin seems to be more interested in the melodic line, this is just kind of connecting these 2 chords together. And if you look at where it's going to where a dominant chord would probably not go. Certainly wouldn't have a tendency to sound like it would go to a minor 5. Now we've talked about the minor 5 before. We usually refer to it as a passing chord. It has no real function in the terms that a dominant chord would have, right? So as we continue on, we look at another chord, another sonority in C minor that just doesn't seem to fit any kind of conventional practice that we've seen in how we analyze harmony. So in this case, the C, G, and then with an A, there's lots of ways that we could probably analyze this chord, but certainly no conventional way, right? Maybe it could be a C minor with the added 6th, but if we look at that, that would mean that this would be some kind of 1 chord that was not preceded by a real dominant chord. Still, you can see how this would be very confusing if you tried to find some kind of Roman numeral with this chord. So here, Marvin suggests that we label these as voice leading chords. And finally, we start to get into an area where we recognize, right? This chord really sticks out because we see the augmented 6th between A flat and F sharp. And I've always reminded you, anytime you see a chord that has a flat and a sharp in it, is either going to be a fully diminished seventh chord, or it's going to be some type of augmented sixth chord, and that's exactly what it is. It's the French variety here. You can see that major second. There's lay going down to sol, and look at fi going up to sol, do, and re. There's our French augmented sixth chord, our first strong predominant. Chopin reminds us that we are, yes, in a key. We are progressing forward harmonically to the dominant and then finally to the tonic, but he strays from the idea of a progression because I think here the melodic line, look at how smooth it is here in the soprano voice and the top voice, and how smooth it is in the bass voice. You can see that why we would call this linear chromaticism, because it takes more of a horizontal approach to harmony rather than a vertical approach to harmony. And she has a more in-depth discussion specifically of this excerpt on page 637 and 638. Okay, so finally I want to look at something that even goes a little bit farther, staying with Chopin, and that is his Book of Preludes, specifically this one in E minor. If we look at all of these chords here, and we know what key we're in here, in this case E minor, we'd say, how do we analyze the harmony? It is seems like it would be maybe second nature at this point to immediately start assigning Roman numerals, but we know from past that the first thing that you want to do is try to get a tonal profile of the piece. We notice right away that there is lots of chromaticism immediately, right? We have the introduction of an E flat. We have a cancellation of the of the F sharp. We have the introduction of a G sharp. We have the introduction of a B flat here. Here's our leading tone, a D sharp, and so forth. So we know that there's going to be some things that we have to deal with. But if you look at that, and Roman numeral analysis would start to look really strange. We would start getting into chords that we are not sure where they are being borrowed from. We're not sure what they're doing. But if you look closely, now thinking about the horizontal approach that I just talked about, we see some things that are very similar, right? It seems like Chopin is also very interested in the idea of the line, the horizontal, right? So this might be a great time to think about how we can analyze this using the concept of linear chromaticism. And of course, we wouldn't want to use Roman numerals for this because that really wouldn't tell us anything about what the harmony is doing. You look at how smooth the voice leading is in all the voices. They're moving down chromatically, one by one, in some cases at different times. Just listen to the opening of this. And that is the excerpt that we see in the book. The music, I think, immediately is logical. It makes sense. Its beauty is in the fact that the melody above these pulsing chords doesn't really move that much. It seems to be kind of hovering around one pitch at the very beginning, this B, and just going up to a neighbor tone, falling back down, going up to the neighbor tone, falling back down, going up to the neighbor tone, falling back down, and then chromatic passing tone down, and you can see the pattern here, right? So it's very static in a way, and it's just like it's falling in slow motion, maybe like a slow motion video of a waterfall or something like that. So you can kind of get a sense of what's happening, but you're not really hearing this as a succession of chords, but rather a succession of lines in each of these chords falling down one by one chromatically, which gives it a really dramatic and beautiful character. So this Chopin prelude in E minor is clearly making use of this idea of linear chromaticism. Marvin really, I think, sums it up well. She specifically talks about this excerpt as having these voice leading chords, like we just saw in the previous C minor prelude example. They're because they're so particularly prevalent in the chromatic harmony of this time. She thinks of them as the incorporation of chromatically altered scale degrees, right? So it opens up many more possibilities for chromatic passing tones, neighbor tones, embellishments, and things like that. So if we think of these as linear chords, right, how are they held together? I mean, what are they doing? I always say a chord is what a chord does. Here, I think the best way to think about this is that they're held together by their voice leading, right? It's very smooth. All the voices are moving down or up, in this case by a whole step or a half step only. And you don't really get any sense of progression or root motion. And I don't think that Chopin would want you to hear that. It allows you to kind of get a sense that everything's kind of falling down together in this very smooth manner. And it's really incredible. So a harmonic analysis of this piece would be probably best served as an explanation of, well, first, what these chords are. Maybe you could give the lead sheet symbols above the measure, and then just a recognition that these chords are not being connected by key. They're not trying to tonicize anything. This whole prelude really stays in E minor. It's very, very short. Even though it has a lot of chromaticism in it, the idea that smooth voice leading can be used to kind of hold these chords together, either by close step movement or common tone that you see here, or pedal movement. That's the idea that really holds this piece together. So this is a really beautiful example of linear chromaticism.